I want to turn this time over to Cliven Bundy. He is a man of courage. He's a man who stood on solid ground. He's a man who stands on the rule of law. He's my friend, and he's about to be your friend just the same. Please welcome to the stage Cliven Bundy.
Thank you, Shane. Can everybody hear me? I'm definitely not a professional speaker, so bear with me, but I do have a message that I hope that will be accepted well. I first just want to reinforce what Shane has said today, and that is that we are standing on solid ground. Because anytime you're standing on the Constitution of the United States, you're standing on solid ground. And I was raised and believe with all my heart that the Constitution of the United States was inspired by our Creator. And that because of that, it is a divine document that we can trust and that we can, again, stand upon. And we stood upon that, and we have stood upon that during this whole battle. And my dad began to understand the Constitution and stood upon those principles many, many, many years ago. And I just can't say loud enough to America that we must get back to the Constitution and stand upon those principles. The incident that's happening to us at the ranch and happened to us is just an example of many, many, many violations of the Constitution. Here we have a very, Shane explained it very clearly. It's not hard to understand. It's very clear that the federal government has only has been granted only certain rights, if you will, or abilities to build and govern land inside a state. And it's outlined. Yet for over 150 years, we've been violating those rules, those abilities that are granted to the federal government, and we have to get back to those things. And it's quite a battle to figure out, well, how do we get back there? How do we get back there? And that's where my story comes in. How do we get back to making this right? And ultimately, what is it? It's to make it right so that individuals have freedom, so that we can walk about and not be afraid, so that we can prosper and live and raise our families, so that we can pass these things on to our children. I've enjoyed a great life so far. I'm 38 years old. I've been able to start a business. I started when I was 22 years old and struggled, but it was mine to make something of. I was able to work hard and find people that wanted my services and be able to do these things and start to prosper a little bit and feel how good it is to prosper. I've been able to enjoy those things in this life, and I want to pass that on to my children. I want my children to be able to do the same thing and to be able to feel those things, but we're starting to get cramped now. We have been for a long time. So my story is simply a story of what happened at the Bundy Ranch and how it gets us back to restoring individual freedoms to each of us, and so we can pass those on. So I live in Levine. I live on the south point of South Mountain there. And so my family's a long ways away. They're about 8 hours away, seven hours away. And my dad's been in this battle for a long, long time, fighting for our rights. And just to set a platform, my family settled the Bunkerville area in 1877. They came in there and the land was completely barren, and they carved a living out of that land. And they began to get it go up on the mountains and establish the waters, and they began to raise the land. They put cattle and sheep, and they began to use that land. And they've been doing that ever since 1877. And that ranch has been passed on, those preemptive rights have been passed on clear down into, so now that my father has it. And so I'm here in Levine, and I have, there's 14 of us, and the ranch can't sustain a whole 14, so I had to go find another living, and I come down here to find that, and I'm grateful to be here. But this thing started to escalate, and the media started to get involved, and they would ask my dad, what is he going to do? And my dad always told the media the same thing. What is he going to do? And that was, he was going to do whatever it takes. And so then they would ask him, well, what is whatever it takes? And he'd say, whatever it takes. And it just drove them crazy that they couldn't get an answer out of whatever it takes. But that's what he was saying he was going to do. And the only thing he said different was that is when it got down to it, he says, I'm going to gather my family together and I'm going to do whatever it takes. And so on March 27th, the BLM came in and they began to set up their compound and military base. And when I say military base, that's what I mean. It was basically they had a perimeter, they had snipers around it, they had, and it was about a 5-acre area. And they had the corrals where they could capture the cattle and put the cattle in there. And then they had communication towers, and they literally said it took them 10 days to set up. And during that time, the reporters were, out there, the media was out there, and there was lots of reports going on. And I'm here in Arizona kind of worried, extremely worried about my family and what's going to happen to them. And I'm calling my dad multiple, he probably got sick of me calling him, and worried about him, worried about what's going on. Asked him if they started trying to gather the cattle yet, and they hadn't during this time. Saturday the 5th, they started gathering the cattle. And the way that they did this is they brought about 200 armed men down on the ranch, and they surrounded and just put a perimeter around all the land on the ranch on the northwest or northeast side of the ranch, and they literally locked the land down. And they not only locked it down to us, but they locked it down to the whole community, everybody. And then they got in there and behind this perimeter, and they started with helicopters and contract cowboys. They started gathering the cattle, and they were pushing these cattle really, really hard. And it was about 100-degree weather, separating the calves from their mothers. And we found out later that it was confirmed that they were shooting them even from the helicopters. And all of this was going on. And meanwhile, the land is locked down. And anybody who would try to go up on the roads or anything, they would stop them with their armed guards, and they weren't able to do that. Well, this went on Saturday and Sunday, and my brothers and my sisters were coming back from church. We have to go to church about 12 miles into Bunkerville, and they were coming back from church, and they could see that there's some activity up there on the hill, so they pulled over to film them. And one of the things that my dad made clear here was that he wanted them to get their hands dirty a little bit. And I think you might have, those who heard him talking on the radio, he wanted them to get their hands dirty a little bit, so that you can't call somebody a thief unless they actually steal something. So this is about day 2 of them getting their hands dirty. And so my brother pulls off this, and he's going to film them with his iPad. And my 2 brothers and my 2 sisters are there, and they've got their children, and they're sitting there on the side of the highway when they noticed up on the hills around them in 4 different areas snipers set up. And they completely set up there and got down, and they put their guns on them. And my brother Ryan took his binoculars and actually looked up there. When he looked up there, he was looking down the barrel of one of their rifles. And we had, like I said, my nephews and my sisters were there. My young sister Bailey was carrying her 8-month-old baby, and my brother's filming this with his iPad, And then out of the hills come about 20 more rangers, agents, and they came down on them, and about half of them forced them by gunpoint with military rifles, forced them into the vehicle while they were beating my brother down on the ground for filming him with his iPad. And they literally beat him to the ground, they tromped on his face, kicked him, sick guard dogs out on him, and then they handcuffed him and threw him in their car and took him to the compound. And for about 4 hours, they just trophied him around and said, look, we got one of Cliven's sons, we got one of Cliven's sons. And that's the way it started on Sunday. They hauled him to, we didn't know what was happening to him, and I'm here in Arizona just beside myself. They hauled him to a jail in Henderson, Nevada, and there they interrogated him through the night. And then that next morning, they cited him for resisting an arrest and failure to disperse, and then they just threw him out on the street and said, we're done with you. And just before I get off this topic, as a side note, when my brother went to go contest these charges, they had mysteriously lost them. And so they're not even in the system. So they can just take and beat a man, get to the ground, punch him, kick him, stomp on him, tromp on his hands, sick their dogs on him, incarcerate him for overnight, and then all of a sudden, and then they just lose the documents. Who can get away with that?
IRS.
Right? Who can get away with that?
IRS.
So anyway, that's the way it started. And again, I'm here in Arizona, and I'm asking my dad, you know, is it time for me to come out? And I want to point out that my dad, a week before this, when they had started to set up, I asked him, well, what can I do? And he told me to prepare to come out. And you know what he told me to bring? Did he tell me to bring all my weapons? Bring everything I could? No, he told me to bring enough food to feed 200 people for 7 days. Because we were going to need America to help us. And my dad knew that at that time. We were going to need America to help us. And he knew that it was going to take the American people to win this, and not the weapons. Although that proved to be a benefit to us all. And I don't want to discredit that. I definitely don't want to discredit that, because have you ever seen there's a video or a picture of they're spraying them, these protesters are spraying with these mace, and it says this is expressing your First Amendment rights without your Second Amendment right. And then it shows a picture of the Bundy Ranch going against the federal agents, and it says this is expressing your First Amendment rights with your Second Amendment rights. So anyway, I got quite a story to tell, so I'm going to get with it. But I'm in Levine, and I'm asking my dad to come out. And earlier during this setup time, my older brother was in communication just briefly with one of the BLM agents who was supposed to be a liaison to the Bundy family. And during that conversation, he told my brother that if we resisted, that it would be another Ruby Ridge or a Waco. And so the facts of standing against the federal government were very real to us, and what might be a possibility. And so finally, late that night, after my dad had spent multiple hours on his knees praying to our Heavenly Father, he finally called us together. And I just want to point out that the difficulty it must have been for him to bring us together, to know that he was asking for our lives. And that's very real. But he did, he called us together. We knew that it was worth it. We knew that the freedom of this country is worth dying for. There have been many, many others before us that died for our freedoms, and many that will die for our freedoms after us. And so we come together, and my dad was able to to go get my brother out of Las Vegas, and I'm preparing. It took me, so he told us Sunday night, Monday morning I left really early. I come down, it takes me all day to get to the ranch. I get to the ranch and it's evening time, and I pull down off the road there, and I come down into the valley, and I can see how it's completely being occupied. That land that I grew up on, that land that I was able to go in the mountains on, was completely locked down with agents at every road, with high technology surveillance equipment on all the paths and all the roads, and that's what I come down into. And my friends, it tore something right out of me. I apologize for being emotional about it, but it literally tore. I felt what it feels like to lose freedom. I had been able my whole life to go up in those hills and enjoy that area. My father has spent his whole life on that land. My great-grandfather, my great-great-grandfather have freely been able to walk that land since it's been known to the white man. And now we couldn't. Now it was locked down. If we stepped off a paved road, we'd be beaten to the ground, chomped on, and hauled off. That is what loss of freedom is. That is what it is. And so I parked my trailer in there and got it set up a little bit. And my dad told me to feed people, and there was probably about 40 people that were there. And my family had set up these great big flag poles, and they were flying the American flag high, and the Nevada state flag, and the county flag were flying them high, and had a banner in between. It said, "Liberty to God and country." And I rolled my trailer in there and began to cook for the people, as my dad had asked me to do. And I set up, and I was probably about 9 o'clock. I was done cooking, and everybody eating, and they were grateful for it. And I was pretty tired, so I got up in my trailer. I didn't want to unload it, so I got up on one of the bunks in there and opened the back, and it was dark, and I could see the lights, and I could see the light of the activity, and the moon was shining pretty good, and I could see the lights, and I could see what was happening, and I could just feel this pit of despair that was inside of me. So I began to, I got on my knees. I didn't know what else to do. I had to get this feeling off of me. So I just knelt down and began to pray. And spent most of the night praying and asking the Lord to help us. And it was probably 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning when a feeling of peace came over me. And the Lord expressed to me 3 different things. He said, one is that you will see soon that you will get your land back. And he said, 2, that many American people will come, many people will come and join you. And 3, that this will be an example of how the American people are to get their freedoms back and get their rights back. And it was very clear to me. And peace was able to come over me, and I was able to sleep. And the next morning, I felt invigorated. I felt happy. I felt excited to be part of something like this. And that's how it was set up. And I wasn't the only one. As many people that came to the ranch there, many of you out here, probably the same, felt that this was a spiritual thing that was going on. This was a spiritual battle. And I have since then tried to put together what that meant, what that means. And our Creator created this wonderful world, who created this wonderful country. He wants us to be free. He wants us to be able to choose Him. And in order to choose him, there's opposition. And he wants us to be able to be free, to be able to be happy, to be able to choose him. And where he is, freedom is. And that's what's made this country such a great thing. And I've been able to understand that through this process. I always thought I understood that, but I've been able to understand it even more. And so this is what happened on Tuesday. And during that day we got up, and there was probably about 30 or 40 people that came to hold signs and to join us in protesting. And off the way we could see, it's about 2 miles away, we could see where these boys from the community, they had a big red truck, and they went down this road, and they got down close to the river, and we could see where the agents were starting to come down on them. And so the protesters there got in their vehicles and drove over there, and they actually created a perimeter between the BLM and these young men. And basically they backed them off. And there was about 5 or 6 of them, agents at that time, and they basically said that you're not going to take these boys and you're not going to do anything to them like you did today. And they backed them away, and they came back, and that was kind of a win for us a little bit. You know, it kind of made us stand. It took courage, but they did that. And Wednesday, so that night, Wednesday, and then in the evening, we were starting to get, a couple hundred people that would come. They'd get off work, and they would come down, and they were, expressing their support, but also their disgust of what's going on. Just kind of a side note, the local community, they actually went in there into Mesquite, and they rented a whole hotel. It's a multi-level motel, and they rented the whole thing out, and they put a perimeter around it, and then they guarded it. And anybody who would come on the grounds, they would threaten them and force them to, make them leave. And that was what was happening in our own town, right in the middle of our town. I mean, that alone is amazing that that's happening actually in our town. And then, then they lock up all the land. And then they threatened. There was community members that went into the land and didn't really know what was going on, and they took their guns and threatened them. And they were completely unrelated to the ranch, but that's what's going on in our own country, in our own area. And so people are coming out in support. The local people, people from the local area, maybe, St. George area, 50, 60 miles, Las Vegas, starting to come. And Wednesday rolls around, and that morning we had a little bit of a confrontation, if you will, nothing big. But then Wednesday afternoon, and you saw a video of it, there was 14 vehicles that were coming out of the mountain, and 13 of them were armed vehicles, and they were escorting a backhoe and a dump truck. And you've seen the videos, so I won't go too much into it, but basically what happened is the protesters went there to ask them, to what was going on. And I took my four-wheeler and I went up around and tried to actually look in the back, get up on the hill and look down in the backhoe, but I couldn't see it. And I personally thought for sure it was a rendering truck. I thought for sure that there were dead animals in there, dead cattle. And so when I came down behind them, I just parked my four-wheeler right in front of them so they couldn't leave, and began to ask, what are you doing with the backhoes? What are you doing here? And I know Shane's been kind to me, but I don't want to take anything away from what those protests, what everybody was doing there. This was an effort from everybody, and everybody was expressing a tremendous amount of courage. Those men, they had dogs, they had tasers, they had their sidearms, their vehicles were, some of them were actually holding rifles, and you don't see that in the video, but there was about 35 to 40 agents that was there. And so you only see probably 10 or 15 of them that was there, but there was a lot more. They were all around the backhoe. They were guarding that backhoe, and they were up on both sides, and they had every weapon that you could think of as far as being able to man to carry. And they were using that to intimidate the people. So I wasn't the only one there that was courageous for being there. You can see there was many, many people that was courageous for being there. And they basically figured that we were, I don't know what they were thinking exactly, but they figured that we were enough threat that they sicked the dog on me. And I just remember in my mind thinking, I'm not going to let that dog chew on me. That's just, I'm not going to, you know, I grew up around dogs and I grew up around big dogs and I just wasn't going to be intimidated by that dog. I wasn't going to let him chew on me. And then when that happened, they tased me, and the first one hit me in the neck and hit me in the chest. And it's a barb that goes in you. It's like a fish hook that goes in you. It sticks in you about a ½ inch. And then it sends a 50,000 volt shock through your body. And your whole body goes through convulsions. Okay? And you start to shake, and I'm told you're supposed to fall on the ground. But when I've been asked that question many times, and I just say I didn't know I was supposed to. My friends, let me tell you what really happened now. Okay? Earlier, Tuesday, I told you about my experience. And when I got tased, I didn't realize this till later so much, but when I got tased, my whole body even messes with the brain. It even makes everything go in slow motion. But I felt my legs were solid on the ground. Very solid. My legs, from my waist down, was solid. And when people say you're supposed to fall on the ground, I thought, there's no way I would have fallen on the ground. Because my legs were solid on the ground. And then they hit me again, and then they hit me again. And 3 times they tased me. And I firmly believe that the Creator of this world gave me the strength to stand. And we were able to stand in front of those people, and what happened is they began to respect us. They began to realize that they're throwing all kinds of things at us. They sick their dogs on me. They've tased us multiple times, and they're at the point where they're going to have to use lethal force if they're going to get this job done. And we're basically at the point where we have now gained their respect. And I start saying, who's in charge? Who's in charge here? And they're starting to kind of, you can see their demeanor start to change a little bit, like they're starting to listen to me. Who's in charge here? Who's in charge? And none of them would take a responsibility who was in charge. So I just started saying, whoever's in charge here, you need to get your men out of here and you need to leave. This is not going to end good, is what I said. And I didn't mean it would end good for them. They're the ones that had the weapons. But that day, they were going to be murderers because we were not leaving. We were staying there. And if it's either them leaving or they're going to kill us this day. And that's the way it stood. And the people stood right beside me, and we stood strong. And they began to, you'll see in the video, if you look at it, they began to rotate themselves around, get in their vehicle, and then they left. And I took the opportunity to duck back around and jump on that backhoe, or that dump truck, and see what was in the backhoe. I thought for sure I was going to get tased again on that backhoe, but I looked in the back of it, and what was in there was rubble from them tearing up the water infrastructure that had been up there, put in there by my forefathers over 100 years ago. And that's what they were doing. They came in there to lock up that land, to destroy any evidence of human usage on that land, and then to continue to lock up that land. And that was what they were going to do. And we have waters all across that mountain. And I am confident to this day that if we would allow them to do that, if we wouldn't have stood that day, they would have tore every one of those water infrastructure down. But because we stood, we only got one of them. And so anyway, that's what happened on Wednesday. On Thursday, so then that video went viral, and millions of people saw that video. And people started coming from all over the country. And we had representatives from every state of the union at the ranch. And they would... they would come up to us, and usually came to a family member and say, I'm so-and-so, and I came from Minnesota. I just drove 20 hours. I'm so-and-so, and I just came from Texas. I'm so-and-so, I came from Connecticut. He said, I just drove 44 hours, and I'm here. And why am I here? Because I felt like I needed to be here. I felt something, they would say. I felt like, and some would recognize it, that it was the Spirit of the Lord that sent them there. But others didn't understand it, but they knew and they felt. And again, that was exactly what the Lord had told me earlier, that people would come from all over. All over. And they did. And the media came too. They came and they started reporting, and more and more people started becoming aware. And Thursday we got the courage to have a community four-wheeler ride. So we got the community together, we got our four-wheelers, we went right up past their barricades, and at this time they had kind of moved out of that area because we made such a stand. They started to move out of the area and started gathering cattle in the other area. So we got on our four-wheelers, and boy, it felt so good to be up in those mountains. And we had reporters that were with us, the community, and we were a little afraid. I'm not going to lie to you. We didn't know what was going to happen to us, but we got up in there and we felt how good it was to be back on our land, enjoy the hills and the mountains, and enjoy those roads, and enjoy everything that we had enjoyed for so many generations. Friday was a pretty quiet day, but yet, well, I shouldn't say quiet day. A quiet day as far as any confrontation, but we had hundreds of people that were at the ranch. And Saturday rolls around. I was just signed and I had 4 minutes, so I got to be quick with this. But Saturday rolls around, and we asked everybody to come Saturday morning, and there was well over 1,000 people that were there at this time now. Actually, probably closer to 2,000 people altogether. And my dad had called Sheriff Gillespie to come out. And this whole time we had been trying to get our elected officials to come out and stand, and to stand for the people. They'd thrown I did forget to mention, they'd thrown my aunt on the ground, and they just hip checked her, just completely slammed her on the ground. They'd done that to my brother. They pointed tasered me, sick their dogs on them, and the whole time we're calling on our elected officials to be here. And so we all gathered together Saturday morning, and Sheriff Gillespie gets up on the stand after my dad had finally got him out there, and he says, I've been negotiating with the BLM. And he says, they're going to stop gathering the cattle. And the crowd cheered. You know, it was something that they were happy. And then they said, you're going, and also they're going to leave. And the crowd cheered. And then he just left it at that. And the people started asking questions, well, what about them doing what they did to us? You know, nothing was said about that. What about them occupying our land? And what about the 400 head of cattle that they had gathered and have in their compound? What about that? And so it wasn't good enough that they were just going to leave, and they were planning on taking the cattle too. And so the people just weren't going to have it. They weren't going to have it, and they were tired of what was happening. And they basically collectively said, let's go up and take care of this mess, because our sheriff won't do it for us. That's why we hire a sheriff, right? To take care of and protect the people, and protect their lives, protect their liberty, protect their property. What else did we hire him for? We didn't hire him for anything else. And so the people moved up there, and there was about 60 horsemen that was on the hill. They moved down and took them, it was about 3 miles away. We moved over to where the compound was, and to make a very long story short, we moved down into the valley, and underneath the underpass there, and we come around the corner underneath, and we look up about a football field ahead of us, and we could see around 200 fully armed, they looked like military. I mean, they were fully tactical gear. They had their military weapons. And they were in stacking position, and they began to, by a bullhorn, tell us that to to tell us that if we make one more step, that they will open fire. That if we do not disperse, they'll open fire. That they have a court order, so they have a right to do that, or whatever, the court order. And the people were afraid. And so what did we do?
Prayed.
We knelt down on our knees and we prayed. And we asked the Lord to give us courage to do what we have to do. Once we got up, we felt that we were sustained, so we started to move forward, and we got between the freeway, and we were still there, and we looked behind us, and we're still, you know, we're moving slow, we're moving forward, and then we look behind us, and here comes about 60 horsemen on horseback, and they came right through us, and just came right on the front. And I know what it feels like to have the strength of cavalry with you. It was sustaining. I mean, it was very strengthening to all of us. And I know their story is amazing too. They had a very similar experience where about halfway there, they got off their horses and knelt down and prayed. Because they too needed courage. And they had a very, very strong experience there. And so all together, the people moved forward. And there's a lot of things that happened. I got to end my story, but we moved forward, and we got to basically where their barricades were, and we demanded that they leave, and that they put down their weapons. And they weren't willing to. They were being pretty stubborn. And we're going back and forth, and it's getting pretty heated. And we're afraid that it's getting to the point where they're going to open fire on us. And then finally, my friends, we see a sheriff deputy work his way down through the BLM agents, and he comes to the fence, and he says, Ammon Bundy, and he says, Ammon, and he knew me my name. He says, my name is Deputy Tom Roberts, and I'm here to help. And then he says, what do you want me to do? And I just said,
More cavalry.
As long as you don't ask us to do something different than we came to do, we'll do what you ask us to do. And we basically began to negotiate a surrender for the BLM. And that's basically what it was. People want to call it what it was, but they wanted 5 hours. And we said, absolutely not. You leave, you get your first vehicles out of here in a half an hour. And they agreed to that. And their first vehicle left in a half an hour. And then after that, shortly after that, 107 other vehicles left with them. That's how many they had down in there. And we opened up those gates, and we went up into that compound, and we got those cattle and drove them down through underneath the bridge there. And we cried, and hugged, and laughed, and smiled, and we were so happy to have those cattle out of there. And Shane and I am really almost done. And but we went into that compound after the cattle got out of there, and the generators were still running. There was personal equipment everywhere. They had abandoned government vehicles. And so don't you think that we can't do that? Those people left in a hurry. They left in a hurry because the American people stood together and they asked their Creator to protect them. And that is the example of how we get our freedom back.